Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Project Flux podcast. I'm joined again with Yoshi. We got a fantastic interview today with Professor Adam Boddison from the Association of Project Management. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And we've been a long time admirers of the talks that you do. And, you do a lot for the industry, a lot for the project management industry in general. And it's really great to have you on the podcast because we really want to talk to you about what the future of project management is and what AI means for the future of project management. So hopefully we'll get a lot of good insights from you. But before we go into that, can we just start with a little bit about you? Because I was looking down your LinkedIn profile and you've had a varied, fantastic career. I mean, I think I even saw hypnotherapist in there. Is that right?
Yes, I did qualify as a clinical hypnotherapist back in the day. The main reason for that actually was because I was working in schools at the time. And what I realised is that there are young people in schools who are excellent when they're learning something and in kind of lessons. Then they go into an exam and they can't replicate the brilliance that they've got in the classroom in the exam. And I realized that this is something to do with mindset, right? It's the kind of the tunnel vision that the athletes talk about when it really comes to that moment. Can you kind of get in the zone and do it? And I thought, is there a way of learning about this? And it turns out that some of the work that happens behind the scenes in clinical hypnotherapy is relevant. Neuro-linguistic programming, there's a lot in that kind of space as well. And a lot of this is also relevant to the business world as well. We all have those in a project context. This is the one that we really need to pull out the bag and make it work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to say it's interesting how these things link together. And my first question was going to be, you've worked in education, you've worked as a hypnotherapist, and now you're in project management. What do you think the thread is that ties those together? Is there any lessons or anything we can learn from your earlier career in terms of project management? You've touched on it already, but if you could kind of expand on that a little bit, it'd be really grateful.
There's a couple of things. I think one of my impressions of the project profession, which makes it distinct to probably almost every other profession, is that it's all about solving the problem. Everybody else is kind of articulating the problem and framing the problem and so on. But actually, we're the people who actually think up the solutions and deliver the solutions. And I think education in general is a bit like that. We've got these young, bright young minds, if you like, and we've got to turn them into these people that are able to go out into the world and make a valuable contribution. And that's not the same now as it was 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. So it's constantly kind of reinventing itself. So I think that's something they've got in common. The second thing for me, and this is probably the bigger thing, is this point around kind of societal benefit. It's the thing that APM really hangs its hat on. We have that expression, because when projects succeed, society benefits.
Yes.
Everybody I meet who's in education and everybody I meet who's in projects, they're in it for kind of the same reason. They want to make the world a better place. In projects, It's one project at a time. In schools, it's one lesson at a time. But the underpinning principle is the same.
Yeah, and it's really interesting as well, because we're going to go on to talk about AI, of course, and the threat, I guess, and some of the naysayers within both industries have very similar kind of points of view in terms of, are we taking away the agency of people for a profession that they love, a profession that they feel that that's their calling, if you like, and if we're handing a lot of it over to technology, what does that mean? Like, take in education, for instance, it feels to me like the education system has been set up very much for a world that's no longer going to exist maybe in 5-10 years time, and perhaps the same can be said of the project management profession.
Yeah, I go even further than that, and I'd say in the same way that in the project management profession there are these kind of green shoots of excellence that are going on, despite there being a kind of general resistance. I think the same is true in schools. So in schools, what you see, for example, is an education system which basically is geared up to say, how do we stop people using AI to game the system? I'm being slightly facetious, but that's the kind of overarching kind of thing. But then when you dig deeper, you find these pockets of excellence. So for an example, you're seeing 8-year-olds in classrooms who are, let's say they're doing creative writing. And so they do a piece of creative writing, they feed it into, some kind of image generation AI, and then it comes up with something. And the child says, I wasn't expecting it to come up with that. I had a different image in my mind. Well, that's because I didn't specify some of those things when I did my creative writing. So what they're using the technology to actually improve their creative writing skills. So that's just a great example of where it's not about replacing one with the other. It's about augmentation and about how one can drive the other. And I think the same kind of thing is happening in the project profession. So there's some really interesting parallels there, I think.
Adam, do you at what point do you think project delivery will be reshaped where the default becomes using AI first in your projects? Or do you think we'll never reach that point?
Well, I think it will reach that point. I think the question is, will the profession be ready for it when it reaches that point? Because the reality is, you have these different generations, right, who are coming through, and there was the generation that grew up with computers, the generation that grew up with smartphones. This generation now, is this the generation that grow up with AI? That's not a learned
Yeah, it's
thing for
crazy.
them. It's just native, right? That's just normal. So when they are kind of the dominant majority of the workforce, that for me is when it will change anyway. And the question is, will the profession, will the wider business world be ready for it when that time comes? I just make one other observation as well, which is that if you look at other technological innovations, the workforce has generally been ahead of the curve. You think when I don't know, when laptops came in, when Microsoft Office started or something like that, people learned about that stuff or used that technology in the workplace first, and then they thought, well, I could also use that in my personal life in some way.
Mm.
AI is the opposite.
It
Because
is, you're
of the
right.
nervousness of business, you've got all of these individuals who are trying stuff out at home and stuff like that, but they're not allowed to try stuff in the workplace because of all of the fears and anxiety. And so when businesses do eventually take the plunge, they're not starting from a steady state where they can control that. They can have all of these different people with different ideas and different levels of familiarity and comfort, if you like, with the technology, and that's going to make it even harder to move the dial, I think, on that when the time comes.
That's so true. We're seeing that is this whole notion of shadow AI. You're starting to block. We've seen a number of companies within the profession try to block the use of AI, and I think that is so misguided because all you're doing is you're encouraging people then to use exactly what you said. Use shadow AI. Use it personally, and then all the risks that go with that because there's no control at all. So it's a funny time we're at because we're not used to this. And the other thing I would say is I think with other technology we've had a good kind of few years, maybe even a generation, to get used to it, whereas this is moving so fast we don't have the luxury of seeing what happens. So it's really great to see what APM are doing, though. I have to say, I've been involved with doing some talks to APM members, and compared to some other institutions, you seem to be really kind of leading the charge with preparing your members for an inevitable future. But before we go on to talking about AI in a bit more detail, I thought it'd be really interesting just to talk about the state of project management today and why we even need to think about it. Because if everything was perfect, we could all just say, well, what everything's fine. We don't need any AI tools. But that's definitely not the case, is it? So what do you think? Why do you think so many projects still fail? Is it a people issue? Is it a planning issue? Or is it something deeper?
Yeah. Well, I think before we get into the kind of the reasons, if you like, I think there's something about the underlying premise of the question. I think we're a bit obsessed with success and failure, and it's quite binary, isn't it? Oh, we've done this piece of work. It's about delivering benefits, and then either it's worked or it hasn't. I mean, I think the real world isn't binary like that, and things change. So, let's take an example. Let's take an IT project, and in the context you've described where technology is moving so quickly, you could have a situation where a company commissions an IT product, if you like, and so a project put into place to create this product or this service. It's a 12-month piece of work. By the time that thing's delivered, by the way, delivered on time, within budget, to exactly the required specification. But because the world's moved on, it's no longer needed anymore. It doesn't deliver any benefit. So it delivers all the outcomes, none of the benefits. So what are we saying about that piece of work? Is that a success? Or is it a failure? So there's some people out there who will say, iron triangle, all of that, that's absolutely a success. Other people would say that's completely irrelevant. It's all about benefits realization, and on that score it fails. And then there's various iterations of that as well. So we don't have a consistent understanding of what we actually mean by success. And so I tend to think it's a bit of a distraction, actually, to start thinking about, well, that one's a failure and that one's a success. I'm much more interested in saying, well, if we were to take the long view and look back at something that we finished, I don't know, maybe even 10 or 20 years later, and governments and big companies are best placed to do this. I'm looking back now with the benefit of hindsight. Would I still have invested the money in that project? Because often there are unintended benefits as well. They're not the ones that are in the business case, right? And that, for me, is where we can take some real learning in the profession and do things that we're not doing at the moment. But usually that's so long after the thing's finished, we don't do it. So that's what we've got to be better at, I think. I don't think you can judge real success kind of after a project's closed. You need that kind of long view backwards.
But Adam, do you think
that
sorry, go on, James.
Yoshi.
I was going to say, do you think though that that's because of the nature of projects, like the fact that change is inevitable, but the nature of projects means that you have an idea of how you want to deliver something. So you set these parameters, you have your schedules and costs, and then your thinking subsequent to that is kind of anchored on something which you think, this is going to work. So when things don't actually quite play out, you have this mental inertia, right? Because you're anchoring it on that. And because of that, I think people are worried about the turbulence of change. Change brings so many different things which can shift. And I think within the project delivery profession, people aren't used to that. So they're struggling to kind of break it and say, okay, things have changed, the goalposts have moved, and that's all right. Because we're still reaching success in other areas. It's just that they still are anchoring it on what they set out in the first place.
Yeah, and I know all the theory on this, and we've got to revisit the business case and update.
Yeah.
But the truth is, I come back to this unintended benefits piece as well. So there's all this other stuff that happens. So I honestly think you have to take that long view, and it's that decision about would I reinvest that I think is the important one. I think as well there's this underlying point here around certainty that kind of underpins some of this. So you take a board, or it could be a government that's about to invest in a multi-billion-pound project over decades and so on. There's these two tensions, right? There's a tension of, well, I want to know exactly how much this is going to cost me, and I know exactly what the outcomes are. And you can do that, but then the cost will be higher, right? Because in order to lock everything down, you've got to factor in so much variability and all the things that could happen. It costs a fortune. And governments, of course, don't want to do that because they say it's all about value for money, right? We're going to get value for money for the taxpayer,
whatever that means.
But then with that, then to get the value that they're talking about, it requires innovation, it requires risk, it requires probably using technology that doesn't exist at the moment, probably in some of these kind of multi-decade problems. So that brings with it a kind of known uncertainty at the outset. But what happens is the people that make that decision, if they make that trade and go, we're going to go for value for money and innovation and all that stuff from the beginning, they're not the people in 10 years who are in front of some kind of select committee trying to justify why it's gone billions over budget. So there's a disconnect between what's happening over time about why certain decisions have been made. That's also a part of the challenge, I think.
Yeah, and it's so difficult, isn't it? Like you say, the thing's moving so fast now. It's almost impossible to predict what, say a building, for example, what that's going to be used for. Because by the time you've gone through the planning, you've gone through the development, you've actually built it, things are going to change massively. So the best thing you can possibly do is build in as much ability for it to be adaptable, I think. And that's where I think AI is a real benefit, because you can start thinking about how you can look at it strategically. And I think what a lot of people aren't doing is using AI as a strategic tool. Is that something that you've seen at all within project managers and the project management profession? People actually using AI almost as another team member to analyze some of those really deep issues about, where could things be going? What should we be thinking about maybe in 10 years' time with this particular development or this particular project?
Yeah, I mean, this use of AI is a kind of critical friend almost. I have seen that happening, but I think it's almost happening in a covert rather than overt way. Because, can you imagine me turning up to my, meeting with my project sponsor and saying, me and the AI have had a chat with this and this is what we've come up with. It doesn't quite play as well as, let me show you my piece of work. I'm not going to lie about the fact that I've used AI, but I don't need to necessarily put that up front. And so there's this kind of ethical kind of question underneath, and that's because there's an uncertainty about how that might be received. And I do think there's this, I talked before we came on air today, I was talking about the APM salary survey, and one of the findings in that, which is quite interesting, is that when they look at the kind of adoption of AI, the early career folk are using it a lot more than the senior folk in businesses, and the confidence, the anticipation, if you like, about the impact that AI will have is much lower at the executive end than it is at the kind of lower end in the workforce. And we know this already, but I think it's really prominent in this year's data. And so that's why I think they would be uncertain in that situation of kind of almost admitting that they've used that as a tool. Even if it was allowed, it's like it's saying that I couldn't cope with doing it by myself,
Well, it kind of backs up a meme we put in the newsletter this week, which was basically saying that a lot of people in these sort of executive positions, they don't really understand AI. They think it's like a SaaS software or like a fridge you go and buy from Curry's and you can just switch it on. And it is a culture and it's a mindset. And what's so interesting about what you just said, Adam, it brings to mind two conversations I had with two different senior people over the course of the last few weeks. One and they were two ends of the spectrum. One was a project manager who had told his superior that he'd used project AI for a particular task, and he was ridiculed for it, made to feel stupid. Oh, you're cheating, kind of thing. And then the other one was a senior person in a software development company who had the exact opposite. He asked the person whether they'd used AI to help, and the person had said almost embarrassingly, no, maybe a little bit. And he said, well, why haven't you? I'm paying you good money, and I don't want you spending time on stuff that AI can do. What do you think the impact is on those two different people?
Yeah, well, it's a slightly leading question, isn't it? We know that one of them's going to be encouraged to do it and one of them isn't. I mean, I just share an APM example just because it, from kind of APM, the organisation rather than the profession. We've just invested in kind of Microsoft Copilot licenses for all of the staff, and of course, some people will naturally get onto that and use it, and others will be like, I don't quite know what I could use it for. And so there was a request that came, and the request was, IT departments, can you give us some ideas of how we could use AI? And I can tell you what the plan is for that session. The director of IT, or the head of IT, I should say, is going to give one piece of advice. And it's ask Microsoft Copilot for ideas on how you can use Microsoft Copilot. That's the end of the session, right?
Yeah, as simple as that. Do you know, when people ask me that question, I've got a simple answer. I go, what can't AI do for you? What can't it help with? Because it's a universal, it's not, you obviously get narrow versions of it, but it's things like ChatGPT is general. So you can use it for anything, can't you? And I think it's a mindset, getting people to realize that they can use it as a starting point for loads of things, like the example you gave about the school child using it as a way for creative inspiration. That's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And my, as someone who's in a leadership position myself, and I'm, as we're talking, I'm reflecting on, organisationally, are we going far enough, ourselves and so on. And I'm struck by one of the challenges is, even if the leadership team, there is kind of broad buy-in at a senior level, at board level and so on, you've kind of got to bring the whole organisation with you. And I see this in the profession, and with APM as the kind of professional body, you've got a really long tail of positions where people are. You've got the evangelists at one end who are about, 10 years ahead of everybody else. And there's not many of them, I have to say. And then you've got this kind of, I think you've got this long tail of people, mostly, I would say, who have an appetite, who want to learn. And then there's the kind of naysayers at the other end, if you remember Baddiel and Skinner when they used to run their Friday night show, it'll never work, that'll never work. So there's all of that at the other end. So you've got everybody in between. And as a profession, it's trying to know, where do you pitch it, right? So do you pitch it at the people with the appetite on the basis that, the naysayers will never look at it anyway and the evangelists don't need it, so we'll just pitch it there? Yeah. Or is that not enough? Because actually we've got to bring the whole profession with us. And that's the kind of constant question we're asking ourselves, is where do we pitch our resources? Where do we pitch our help, our support, our effort to move the profession itself forward?
Adam, you mentioned the APM salary survey, and what you mentioned around the younger generations are using AI a lot more effectively, or they're using it more frequently, and therefore the impact that they see that it will have on the profession is significantly different to those who are a lot older or senior. Because of that, and going back to earlier in the conversation, we mentioned, there'll be new ways of working. You tend to find that there'll be emergent properties that come out of that. There'll be new things that we haven't really thought of in terms of how AI might impact the profession. So I guess for the APM then, and kind of looking at these results from this survey, how does that impact how far you look into the future for AI as the APM?
Yeah, it's really, and that's part of a bigger question of strategic planning as to how far in advance can you look. I feel like we kind of tend to look about 5-6 years ahead, but probably every year we have to rewrite our 5 or 6 year plan. So it's, so we kind of ask ourselves the question, is it worth doing that? But I think you do need to take that long view. I think one of the big debates we've had when it comes to the AI bit specifically is, to what extent do we produce kind of AI tools, if you like, to help project professionals versus helping people to be comfortable with using AI tools that other people create. And I think over time, we've probably landed that our role is on the latter, because we're not a software house. And no amount of money that we could put into this is going to be as good as what's going to be freely available and everything else. And so we've toyed with this idea, should we be creating AI versions of various products that we've got and so on, so it can be interrogated in different ways. And we've tended to not do that. Now, some of our competitors, well-known competitors, have done that. So I guess time will tell that pitched about right. But I very much see that our role is to promote the use of AI and to help people to be able to use what's available to them, whether that be commercially available or freely available or in some other way. That I think is about how you build capability, capacity, confidence in the technology going forward in the workforce. That's where I think it's the role of a professional body to get involved.
Are there any points of AI that you are concerned about as the APM?
Well, yeah, I mean, a big one is around the environmental impact, which interestingly, I think it was in the salary survey, only 1% of project professionals felt that they thought this was an issue.
Really?
Not specifically around the impact of AI on environmental sustainability in general.
Really?
So that surprises me, because I think it's like a ticking bomb, right? I mean, there's clearly something we've got to think about there. But there's a couple of statistics on this, right? And open to challenge on these. But the one that was widely reported was around the kind of, I think it was every 30 to 50 uses of something like ChatGPT uses the equivalent of a 500 milliliter bottle of water to cool a data center. Another one is the one around AI image generation, and for each image that's generated, it takes the equivalent energy of a half of a smartphone charge. So when you start to think about those type of stats, I think it brings home a particular question for me, which is, do we really understand the true cost and weigh that up against the benefits? Because if I'm using the technology to find a cure for cancer, there's a pretty strong business case for that, right? I think you can make the case. If I'm using it to write bedtime stories for my 5-year-old, that's not pretty unconvincing. And I'm choosing deliberately two extreme examples. You get the idea. And I don't think anyone anywhere is really thinking about, so what is an appropriate cutoff there in terms of where we should and where we shouldn't use this. The evangelists say use it for everything, and they say oh, it'd be a terrible thing, no one should use it, and most other people are waiting to be told. So that for me is a big question that we've got as not just as a UK society, as a global society. We've got to get to an answer on that at some point pretty quickly.
It's very difficult, isn't it? And it's the old chicken and egg situation. The great hope is the more that we invest in AI and the more that we improve AI, it will start actually solving some of these sustainability problems. But that's a guess. We don't know that for certain. And in the meantime, you're right, people are using it to create ridiculous memes, guilty as charged, whereas some people are using it for really good uses. But I think it's, in a way, I heard someone talk on another podcast, it's almost too late, isn't it? Because the genie's out of the bottle as far as I can see. It's not like we could say this has gone too far, let's stop, because if we do, then the Western world basically hands over the mantle to China and other countries. So we've got to keep up. And then the other thing I think we've made a mistake about as a society is we really should have been spending the last 20 years or so anticipating this, and it's come so fast by surprise. We're not ready to deal with it. We're scrambling around to put regulations. That's on a governmental level, and then obviously at sort of professional levels we're trying to work out what to do. It didn't necessarily have to be that way, because I think it was all, well, you only got to look at the sci-fi films of the last 20 years to know that it was predicted. I don't think anyone knew it would have come this fast, but it was coming.
Well, I mean, we had a great talk actually at one of our away days at APM, where we had somebody come in and look at kind of the evolution of technology, and they showed a Back to the Future film from however many years ago it was, these 80s, whatever it was, and how much of that technology does actually exist. And it's staggering how much of it has come true.
But we still don't have a hoverboard, so I'm really upset about that.
Well, I think hoverboards do exist. I think they're just not mainstream use and probably too expensive, but they definitely exist.
And this is really have to look at as well, because I mean, is AI itself sustainable? And you could argue depends on the use case and why you're using it. But from a project perspective, we need to power these things with data centers. So for construction, it allows the proliferation of new data center builds where, if you're innovating at the cutting edge, ideally you can drive down costs, and that will trickle all the way down from the macro of the actual construction asset all the way to the silicon chips and how these things are built and how they compute. So I guess it is a bit of it's how you look at it, right? Because you're hoping that, we build these things with a lot more efficiency to the point where they can power AI models and Moore's law kicks in, it becomes a lot cheaper, and then we can actually use it to build more projects and be optimal in that sense. But I guess it's kind of short-term to mid-term pain for long-term game is the hope, I guess.
That's the hope. There
are other shows in town though as well, remember. So, I mean, I know we've focused a bit on AI today, but, what happens when quantum computing comes along? Yep. The power that's going to take, the AI looks small compared to that, right?
Yeah.
And when those things start combining with each other, we're getting into orders of magnitude beyond what we're even thinking about at the moment. So I think there's a bigger picture here as well, which I think is quite challenging, and we're not that far away from this stuff.
No, and they all combine. People look at them as distinct technologies, but you say about quantum computing, but of course quantum computing will then power even better AI. They will power robotics, which will work its way into warehouses, into construction sites. So it all rises together at the same time, which actually leads me nicely on to the next topic, actually, Adam, and a big question. There was a study by Gartner which said by 2030, 80% of project management tasks will be run by AI. So is AI going to replace project managers?
No, in short. I'm not saying I disagree with Gartner, of course, that's a very reliable source, but there's an implication there, isn't there, that by saying 80%, that, only 20% of the role is kind of human delivered. And I think that's because when you're talking about tangible tasks, that's different to the kind of intangible impact.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that other stuff that happens. And I'm not saying, by the way, AI can't do any kind of people type stuff, but I think people do that very, very well. And often it's those, we call them the soft skills, the PMI call them the power skills, It's those human interaction skills that often make the difference between something getting over the line successfully and something not, because of those relationships that exist. And I think one of the big tests for the technology is how well can it replace some of that. I think it's pretty good. There's all the stuff around sentiment analysis and all of that. So I think it's pretty good at kind of identifying what the optimum solution is. The challenge, though, I think for the technology is that the optimum solution isn't often the right way to go. Because often when you're dealing with people, it's not about doing it perfectly. It's about all of the other things that are going to influence how they think, how they feel. And actually, that's not often the optimum solution. On paper. We see it all the time in boardrooms where, interviews, let's take interviews as a great example. Who's given the best answer to the question, who's displayed the best body language and so on. Everything gets scored. How often do you have senior managers who are leading an interview panel who go, that this person's come out with the best score, but my gut tells me that other person's going to be the one that we need to go for. Can the technology replicate that bit? If it can do that, then I think we've got to be a bit worried about the people side of project management. But I'm not convinced it can do that as well as people can yet.
No, I agree. That's the human connection part, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, Adam, because we've been doing these podcasts for about a year now, and different themes start to emerge at different periods. And the big one that's coming out from a lot of people, and you've kind of touched on that as well today, is the fact that AI is going to do loads of great stuff. It's going to take away a lot of the grunt work. It's really incredible. It's going to change the profession, but it can't replace being a human. And I think you even talk about that in your LinkedIn about project management needs to be more human. So in an AI context, I think what's incredible is, funnily enough, we're going to do full circle. And the thing that we're all going to have to get better at, whether as project managers or just as human beings, is the human skills, the communication skills, the emotional intelligence. And that's what makes a good project manager, isn't it? Being able to communicate, being able to understand what our clients' needs are.
But in terms of a devil's advocate here, because you would assume that we're building projects where we have a hybrid of both AI and humans, right? Because like you said, there are so many intangibles associated with Qualia and all these things that we resonate with others. But if you were to picture that a project was just delivered by AI, at that point, would that eliminate the need for soft skills? Or do you think, because for me, there's still an element of, well, humans still have to be able to speak to humans and speak to AI. So there's still that social element. But if it was just AI and then, their embodied counterparts or their embodied supplements in robots, for instance, do you think that would eliminate that?
I think it's different, isn't it? And I think some of it comes down to preference around the kind of organisation you are, to the kind of projects you want to deliver. So let's say if you were delivering a nursery for school children, for babies or whatever, you can imagine that somebody whose passion is about children, if they've got a choice between, let's say, a fully human project delivery team or a fully AI technology enabled project delivery team, would there be a bias towards having more humans involved because the business itself is about people? That's the bit that's quite interesting for me. You kind of see it. Let's take something like completely separate to projects. Take something like communications. We move from handwritten letters, if you like, or printed letters, and we move to email and all kinds of other weird and wonderful technologies. But letters are still around. In fact, there's been a bit of resurgence, right? So companies now, when they want to market something, to cut through all the noise of what's happening in the tech space, they go back to letters.
Yeah,
There's a bit of me that kind of says, does the fact that the human part of projects kind of changes over time actually make it a premium feature of projects going forward?
Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting idea.
And funny you mentioned that, because I saw something recently, and there was a guy who sells these services, and he has 100% conversion rate, and his conversion tactic is whenever he sees a CEO, he actually gets a hand carved sword delivered to them with their name and say, "We're in this war together," and his conversion is 100%.
There you go. And it's interesting, isn't it? So the retro stuff comes back in. So I think there's something about. I don't think the human part will ever go. There'll always be a place for it, and that's not to say that it's because the tech can't do something that the humans can do. Although that I think still needs to be tested. But even if it could do everything, I think there's still going to be some people, some projects that go, yeah, but I want my project delivered by people.
Yeah. Do you know what? We've said this a few times, that it won't be too long in the future before you get a consultancy somewhere saying their selling point will be, we don't use AI. Obviously not at the moment because it's the buzz, but give it a couple of years, I can see
Yeah.
that happening for sure. You
Yeah.
pay a premium, yes, you pay more, but there's no AI involved here. It's all humans. So watch this space. Adam, can you just tell us about some of the things that APM are doing in terms of AI? I'm familiar with some of them. I'm on the AI and data working group, and fed into the data part of the body of knowledge. But you're doing so much, from the kind of local level all the way through to things like the body of knowledge. I'm probably missing a lot. So could you just maybe sort of sum up what the APM are doing?
Yeah, and of course you're assuming now that I know everything that's going on across the whole of APM and the profession. But look, there's a few big things. So you mentioned the kind of the advisory group and so on. So there is an interest network around AI. So anybody who's out there who is currently an APM member, for example, might be interested in getting involved in that interest network, because that's where they can keep up with the latest information about what we are doing in this space. But the advisory group was. And the working group have come up with some really interesting kind of assets which are freely available out there. So some of that's around data analytics, not just AI. And as we've kind of referenced today, those things are obviously quite closely connected. You can't really do one without the other.
Exactly.
So we've got some stuff around actually really understanding what we're actually talking about. So a kind of getting started guide.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about AI and data analytics, are we talking about the same things? It's like the old agile conversation, when you see these two agile people talking together and they're arguing, and you go, yeah, but you're not talking about the same version of agile. Right? So,
exactly
so there are lots of different variations. So it's making sure we're talking about the same thing. We've then got a kind of skills guide, which is really getting into different personas. So if you are a risk analyst versus if you are a project sponsor versus you're a PMO lead or whatever, what does that mean in terms of the kinds of skills and competencies you need to have to be able to do your job well? It's not an exact science. I think it's more of a kind of starting point, but it's a helpful benchmark to think, if I'm doing one of those roles, what do I need to have up my sleeve in terms of the right skills? That's quite useful. And then we've also, within the last year, published with the Major Projects Association, number 10, and part of and IPA, now NISTA, in government, their data analytics and AI strategy, which is for publicly funded projects, but of course lots of the private sector will be involved in that through the tier 1, tier 2 supply chain and so on. So that's a really good insight, I think, into the direction that government's going. And of course, APM is support the skills and competence agenda side of that. So they're the kind of the big ticket items. But then there's a lot of stuff going on, as you talk about. Within the kind of the different networks that are out there, they're running events. It's a big theme in the body of knowledge, as you mentioned. We've got our annual conference coming up. Not a surprise, it's a big theme there. So it's kind of a bit of a golden thread through almost everything that we're doing in one way or another.
How granular do you see the APM playing in terms of project delivery? Do you see it being something which is a lot more high level, focused on, bridging the skills gap? Or do you see it being more involved with, because the whole movement around coding, for instance, being eliminated by all these new foundational models and the new tools that are coming out. And that might seep into project delivery. And we cover it at Flux. You say, you can use code and build applications in your projects, but there's still a big disconnect. And that's something which, the associations might want to play into, but there's so much complexity there. So how granular do you see the APM's involvement going into that side?
Brilliant question. And because it's a live question that we're talking about, and not just the coding side of things. There's lots of other aspects which you could have, replaced coding with in the question that you've asked. I think if I go back to what I said before, we're not a software house. We're also not a kind of, coding training company either. So I don't think it's our role to be doing that. But it is our role to be able to say whether coding as a skill is relevant to being a really effective project professional, and flagging that up if that's the case. And sometimes it's not just about being able to code. It might be being able to understand why coding is helpful in project delivery, because it depends on exactly which role you're in. And actually understanding that is a useful skill set drives people to then develop those skill sets. Take something like conflict resolution, which is one of the competences in the competence framework if you want to be chartered. APM's not out there training people on how to do really effective conflict resolution. We've got some resources there. We've got some ways of assessing that in terms of the chartership. But what we're doing is driving the workforce to say, if I want to be a really effective project professional, I need to make sure I understand conflict resolution. Yeah. The same applies to things like coding. And if we're saying actually Python's the language that you really need to make sure you understand, and you need to be able to code in it, but you need to have some basic knowledge of it so that you understand what's going on.
So it's more steering the profession
we can have. Yeah, exactly. So it's about shaping the priorities, setting the baseline of competence for project professionals as they go through the different stages of their career or as they specialize in different roles. It's not necessarily about replicating every skill in every possible area and trying to do that. Yeah. If we tried to do that, we'd be out of business pretty quickly because we just couldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a very good strategy. Adam, we're coming towards the end, and for the last few minutes, we like to ask some kind of off-topic questions about you, really, to get some advice from your career. So the first question from me is, what has failure taught you that success never could?
Wow, big question. Well, like everybody, whether they admit it or not, I've had failures in my own career, my own kind of personal life as well. And of course, there's the whole kind of stereotypical, what it doesn't kill you, make you stronger and all that. For me, it's slightly deeper than that. It comes back to values and ethics, because we can all talk good values and good ethics, but it's only when you really make a decision that is ethically questionable and you reflect on that and it plays on your mind and you go, was that the right, that for me is if you make a mistake because you've made the wrong ethical decision, that really shapes your behaviour going forward. And there's been a few times in the past where I thought I'd been making the right decision at the time, but retrospectively I thought, no, I was guided by the wrong principle there, or I was thinking about the wrong priority, the wrong people. And if I had my time again, I'd do it differently. But for me, that it's those failures, the ethical failures, that are the biggest ones. And I have a little mantra that I say to myself now, which whenever I've got to make these kind of hard decisions, I say, I must do what's right rather than what's easy.
Yes, that's brilliant.
When life's hard, you want to take the easy path, the path of least resistance. And there's been a few times when I've taken the right over the easy path, and I've given myself a lot of hard work. But I tell you what, when I look back on those decisions now, I feel happy that I did it.
Yeah.
So
wow.
That's the big thing.
That's massive, and it can be quite grey, can't it? So there's a lot of soul searching involved, and I think you haven't really gone through those kind of positions until you're faced with one of those dilemmas. So I think you're right. There's nobody in the whole world who can say that they haven't had failures, but it's what you do with the failure, because they're all learning experiences, as I say.
What I'd say is, for anybody that's facing a kind of hard challenge, one of the things I do now, it's a very practical thing, or tactical, practical, whichever we say, which is I think about if it was one of my children who was in the situation that I'm in and they came to me for advice, what advice would I give them? And I do this for two reasons. One, we hold, I think, people we care about, it could be your child, friend, whoever, we hold them to a higher ethical bar than we hold ourselves to.
Yes.
Right? Because we don't want them to do something bad that's going to impact them. So it just raises the ethical bar of your own decision making. But two, it depersonalizes it. It takes you almost like out of body experience where you can kind of take a more objective view, even though really it is about you. And it's really, really simple. It doesn't cost anything, but by golly, does it help you make a better decision?
I like that, because it removes that personal bias. But and this kind of takes us onto legacy. So Adam, when you leave the profession, what sort of impact would you like to be known to have provided or given to the industry?
Yeah. Well, I'd say I don't really go to bed thinking about legacy or wake up thinking about legacy. And maybe that's something that will happen later on. But, if I try and summarize, over the last 4 years, what's the thing that really is driving me? So we've already had the kind of the societal benefit piece. So, if there are things that have happened under my tenure which have helped to improve society directly or indirectly, clearly I'd be really pleased with that. But there's one thing that could make that happen. I think it's removing the kind of the fractures that exist within the profession. So I often talk about there are many parts, many organisations that make up the project profession, but ultimately it is one profession.
Yeah.
And what I don't like is when I see, I'm not anti-competition, but I don't like seeing unnecessary fracture or disagreement when actually we can pool resources, we can align efforts. The sum is, the sum of the parts is, is greater than the whole, and all of that type of stuff. That for me, if we can get to a world where, everybody that cares about this stuff can use their efforts in tandem to therefore drive progress more quickly, that's a great thing. So one profession, that's what I'm really pushing for.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think, and that's the wider profession, not just project management. I think the whole kind of project delivery profession could do a lot and learn a lot from each other. I for instance, I'm a member of the RICS. I think the RICS and APM could do a lot together. There's a lot of crossover there. And there's a lot.
Did you know, James, that we actually, with RICS and also CIOB and APM, we've actually published a kind of Chartered Plus, I suppose you'd call it, which is in response to the kind of the Grenfell disaster and some of the kind of baseline competence standards. So it doesn't matter which of those professional bodies you kind of start your journey. We have a common standard now across the three, which meets the expectations of the building safety.
That's a brilliant example.
That's the kind of thing we need to do.
It can be done. It can be done. That shows. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Adam, we're coming towards the end of the podcast. What's the one question that you wish we had asked you that we haven't?
Oh, crikey. One question that you could have asked me, Adam, would you like to double your salary? And I'd say, oh, yes, please.
If we had the power, we would. I promise.
I don't know, but to be honest, I think that the questions have been pretty wide-ranging. We've covered a lot of ground.
We did cover a lot.
Yes, I can't think of anything immediately off the top of my head.
That's good. That makes us feel like we've done our prep properly. Well done. Where can people find out more about you and the APM? I know you're quite active on LinkedIn, for instance, but where else can people reach you?
Yeah, the main place for me is LinkedIn. Definitely, I'm active on there. I've come off some of the other less palatable social media platforms, but LinkedIn is definitely the way to find me. I'm easy to find at / Adam Boddison on there, the handle. In terms of APM, that's apm.org.uk is the website. And of course, APM is also on LinkedIn as well. I'm very active on there. In fact, it's LinkedIn and TikTok, believe it or not, are the two fastest growing channels for APM. So for different reasons, but yeah. So for those who are active on TikTok, check us out on there too.
I didn't know you were on, but I'm going to go and check that out after this. And we'll make sure we put all those links on the show notes, and some of the things that we talked about, like the skills guide and the body of knowledge. We'll get that all on the show notes as well for anyone who wants to find out a bit more. But Adam, thank you so much for your time. It's been a brilliant conversation. Like you said, very wide ranging, and we could have gone on for hours, but we do try and keep it to about 45 minutes for the average commute. But hopefully you'll come back on another time to talk about what's happening with the APM, maybe in a few months or a year's time or so.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thank you both. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Project Flux is here.
That's a wrap for today's episode. But before you go, exciting news. Project Flux is teaming up with Project Management Global to bring you the latest in AI-driven project delivery and essential management insights. Through this partnership, expect weekly AI insights, practical tools, and expert thought leadership, ensuring you stay ahead in the evolving project landscape. Stay tuned for exclusive content, joint research, and strategies to supercharge your project outcomes. You can learn more at www.pm-global.co.uk and be part of the future of project management. See you later.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.